Welcome to CivilNet. Today is May 6th. It's a historic day in Armenia, not because we're having parliamentary elections, but because these particular elections are quite different from those that have come before. And we're going to be speaking about that with our guest, Richard Giragosian, who has been, and I hope will continue to be, a guest here on CivilNet. And Richard, we're watching our elections today, and on a day when the world is watching France and Greece and London.
Serbia.
Serbia. So we're all busy trying to figure out our futures. And for those of us watching us from outside of Armenia, trying to figure out the processes that are so different here, not unique perhaps, but certainly different. Let's try to step back just a little bit and talk about what happens here, what the expectations are here, how perception is often so different from reality. Obviously, the thing at the forefront of everybody's mind is that these elections be free and fair. So perhaps we should talk about how in the past they have not been free and fair. What are the mechanisms that make them unfair? What is it that people have done? Really, there's only 3 or 4. Where do we start? Which one is the most egregious, the most in-your-face obvious?
Well, let's start with the voter list itself, because what we also see is an important prerequisite for both an unfree and unfair election, but also a much improved democratic election, is the starting point in terms of who's registered, how many, and who they really are.
And so if that list is inaccurate, then obviously you're either going to have too many artificial voters or too few real people will get to vote. So that's step one, and this time the issue has been that on the one hand, the lists have been checked, double-checked, triple-checked. On the other hand, there are all sorts of accusations of either dead people or too many people in one address or artificial people, right, phony names. What are some of the other potential areas that we're all watching?
Well, potential areas, and to be honest, Armenia is not unique. In other words, we see the same policy and patterns of violations, even in previous US elections, to be honest. Absolutely. It's not an aberration. However, because Armenia is much smaller, I would argue that the standard is much higher in terms of it's more difficult to hide and to downplay egregious and irregularities and violations in terms of voting. What we also see as a second method, however, is, for example, if I'm voting for Salpi Ghazarian, and if I take it upon myself through this mechanism to vote in others' names.
So your point about this isn't unique certainly is valid. The difference, though, is probably the matter of trust, and we'll get to that in a minute. Right. So we've got voting in others' names. We have blocks of people voting.
Exactly.
On the one hand, you're thankful that soldiers are allowed to vote, and on the other hand, the fear is that because this is what's the word, a highly authoritarian, disciplined system, then those soldiers may feel compelled to vote in the way in which they are encouraged.
Well, even more than that, I would argue the same thing applies to some factories, where on the factory floor, workers are a little bit pressured, if not intimidated, sent a clear message what they're expected to vote for and who. We also see in hospitals and civil service the same use of administrative resources, or what I would say is rather the advantage of incumbency in terms of whoever is sitting on top, using networks of patronage over acceptable limits. So, but the military is probably the most distressing because it's some of Armenia's best and brightest, youngest. It's not a voluntary force, it's conscription, it's everyone. And it also means that the Armenian Armed Forces has been one of the sources and institutions of pride and trust for so long that any irregularities within the barracks, within the voting system, is therefore doubly unacceptable. Another interesting example, the penal facilities in Armenia, prisons. There's an interesting election polling station in the Giragosian penitentiary, which, to be honest, is also a source of further, perhaps, intimidation. Not exactly the freest and fairest place to vote either.
And the last one, the most obvious one, is actually being given money, given a bribe,
yes,
and told to vote for a certain person. Now, except for this last one, or even maybe including the last one. There are people watching us now who are thinking
much more closely.
Well, much more closely here, but people who are watching you and me talk, people who are going to say, for Pete's sake, each one of those, I can easily say no and do it my way, can't I? So what is it that makes the situation here so much more problematic and so much more distressful?
This is important in terms of revealing the difference between perception and reality, or theory and real life. Because what we see, to be honest, for the villager, for the unemployed, for the nuclear physicist with a PhD driving the taxi for 12 hours a day, there's no real choice. A $12 bribe is something that, unfortunately, is the trade-off in terms of giving up his vote. But there are two deeper problems here. One is a problem shared throughout the world, in that the unfortunate, misguided perception that my vote is only one vote. It really doesn't matter. Yes. This is something we need to correct in every country, every democracy. But the second is more interesting, and that is, I would argue, peer pressure. Because if we look in the village, in the regions, what we see is sometimes it's more dangerous and more vulnerable to say no to a bribe than it is to accept it, if the bribe is by the village head. In other words, retribution for not conforming to going along with these playing rules is especially dangerous. And no one in the village wants to be the first one to stand up for democratic ideals in reality.
And at the end of the day, the administrative resources kicks in there, because people are easily convinced, are made to believe, or in fact do believe, that something was changing and improving, and suddenly if the power source changes, then whatever was happening may in fact not come. I may not get water, I may not get services, and so there's that. But look, at the end of it, at the bottom of everything we've said is the one thing that we haven't, the one word we haven't used, and that's trust. At the end of the day, if the voter trusts that his vote will count in the way in which he meant it, and if those who are actually in charge of the processes, all of the parties all together, actually trust each other to count what's there, we wouldn't have half these problems.
No, but let me take that one step further, in that trust is something that doesn't come automatically. It's similar to legitimacy. It's earned. And in many cases, in Armenia especially, there's been no real desire or effort to earn public trust. If we look at the public servant, there's an interesting contradiction here. A public servant in a modern sense, whether it's the police to protect and serve, a public servant in Armenia generally sees the public as the servant rather than their elected duty.
The term isn't even used.
Exactly.
The term isn't even used.
And the lack of trust also is a bigger problem, in that what we have, even with the new parliament to be elected, it's still a parliament of individuals, much more than it is an institution. And it's the lack of trust and credibility that is actually the catch-22. Does trust come first before democracy, or only through the democratic process can trust be earned? And that's why civil society needs to play an even greater role and be more civil in terms of working within the system, not just throwing stones at the system.
Is it fair to say that this time around civil society has in fact taken steps that are new? There are a bunch of new initiatives out there that have really kicked in this time.
Yes.
There is IT-Dort, IT-Dort.org.
Yes.
Maybe you'll describe what it does.
Well, ID-Tort is actually cutting edge. It's using a technology that was developed first in a Kenyan presidential election in 2007 or 8, using the Ushahidi technology, Ushahidi, which is you witness. And literally it's real time, with some filters, real-time collection of reports of violations. But it's a good snapshot not only of the election, but of civic activism in the different precincts
and willingness to be engaged.
Yes.
And because a version of this was used in the Russian parliamentary elections in December, Armenian civil society kicked in early on, and Counterpart and a few other organizations supported this. And the last I checked today, it's about 3:15 Yerevan time, we had a little under 800 declarations, notices of...
But for a country this small, that 800 is much more impressive than it sounds to the average viewer. Because in many ways, that's 800 times something was reported. What that means is there's probably another 8,000 unreported. In other words, it does capture that civic activism has been building momentum in general, whether it's Mastots Park, whether it's environmental issues from Tehut, saving the forest, to actually urban planning violations. We do see much less apathy and much more civic activism, and not directly related to partisan politics, which also gives us more hope.
Another expression of that is the fact that in addition to the international observers sent by the OSCE, ODIHR, Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, in addition to the Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly, in addition to the CIS observers.
And European Parliament.
And European Parliament observers. In addition to all of the internationals, short-term and long-term, there are nearly 30,000 local Armenian observers this time, which is an incredible number.
And generally more authentic.
Authentic in the sense that they understand the...
Indigenous. In other words, to be honest, from our point of view, observers coming in, flying into a country they've never been to before, has a lot of trouble and challenge adjusting to our unique Armenian political reality. It's even difficult for you and me sometimes to understand, let alone for the foreigner. So in this way, where the larger force of election observers are local Armenians and civic activists, their results will only bolster and more balance the findings, whatever the findings will be.
And they're there. I voted this morning, and they're there. They're there counting the number of voters. They're there filming the actual voting process.
Good.
And we'll see where all of this brings us. We'll talk to you later today, I hope.
Of course.
We've been talking to Richard Giragosian. This is CivilNet. Stay with us today, throughout the day and throughout the week, as we bring you developments in Armenia's parliamentary election, which takes place all day today, Sunday.